Well, today's going to be a fun discussion. For now, I think it is time to talk about an ancient and powerful evil being. Undead creatures that are simultaneously some of the most powerful and resilient you can imagine, while also being surprisingly filled with weaknesses. Creatures of darkness that drink blood in order to sustain themselves. I am of course talking about the cursed vampire. Cursed being the right word here, for most people who are turned into vampires do not choose to be one. Rather, the one who turned them did. See, vampires are made when another drains them of their very life force. Most do this by simply drinking the blood of their victim. And once it is all gone, the victim is dead, and the vampire must simply wait. For once that person is buried, they will rise again under the vampire's direct control. Now, the one that raises here is classed as a vampire spawn at the time, for they are a lot weaker than the main vampire, and cannot disobey a command they are given. Now, they are not loyal or loving in any way, at least no magic compels them to do so. They would disobey a command if they could, they're just completely incapable of doing so. I imagine some sadistic vampires like to pick figures that would deliberately despise them just to torment them even more. However, most vampires seek out weaker-willed people, or people they have previously groomed to become their spawn, since it's a lot more safe and reliable to have minions that like you. I should also note that they have to kill the target for them to raise again as a spawn. A vampire can drink someone partly and not kill them, and if they leave them alone for whatever reason, they won't suddenly become a spawn or eventually become one once they eventually die. They're just safe. It's just, well, they don't do this often, if at all. It's like pouring yourself a glass of wine and not finishing it. Yes, we've all done something like that at one point or another, but most of us tend to finish something as to not waste it. That's genuinely how the vampire views the people they are feasting on. It's like missing out on a middle slice of bread or not finishing those last few drops of a drink. The spawn will grow a bit more powerful over time, but are very much limited in what they can do, and they are cruelly stuck with all of the weaknesses of being a vampire, and not even half of the powers. Both of those I will go into more detail a little bit later. They cannot create other vampires either, nor can they grow any stronger up to a certain point until they become true vampires. And there is really no way they can become free on their own. It is their master that must make them a true vampire. They do this by making the spawn drink from their own blood, and once this is done, they will begin to become a true vampire. They will grow in power and become free from their master's control. This, however, is not that common, since vampires often love to lord this over their spawn, and often have no intentions to actually free them unless the power gain is truly worth it. This is the primary and most common way a vampire, a true vampire that is made. But there are a few other smaller and much rarer ways. One is simply a dark magical ritual. The knowledge on how to actually do this is known by very few, and almost all of those who have learned it have done it themselves, since that's why they sought it out in the first place. Sometimes this can backfire though and make you much weaker than a regular vampire. Another is to be cursed by a powerful celestial, sometimes an actual god, which seems a bit bizarre to me, since most gods utterly despise the existence of vampires and give them their main weaknesses, but I suppose weirder things have happened. And lastly, some legends tell that demons are able to turn people into vampires. Some powerful ones can make deals with mortals to turn them into a vampire, usually under that demon's control. And there's a particularly fancy tale where if a succubus falls in love with someone and gives them a true and genuine kiss, that can turn them into a vampire. Though I should note both of these are old legends, ridiculously old legends, and should be seen as just that, legends. But despite all of these methods, almost every vampire is made by another vampire. Now then, vampires have many flaws and caveats of their being that they just have to deal with during their life. There are the more obvious ones, but I'd like to start with the first one they will notice, and that's the soil around them. See, they are tied to the ground in which they were buried in, as well as the coffin, or its equivalent. They cannot rest in a land outside of the one they are buried in, or at least what they consider that to be. The only way that they can rest outside of the soil is to do so within the coffin or equivalent they were buried in. But there is a hilarious workaround. See, they can actually scoop up and bag some of the dirt and just take it with them. If they place it under their new resting point, that would work just fine, hilariously enough. Why this happens is actually even more funny. This is essentially a self-made weakness. See, vampires are very emotional by their nature. They very much feel that they should not be apart from where they died. Perhaps out of some horrid guilt, perhaps out of some burden, they need to be near the land that they deserved to be buried and died in. They need to be near it. The thing is that when they're awake, they don't really care about it, so they just find this as a major annoyance. The next weakness is more commonly known. Sunlight will kill them, often quickly if they're completely exposed to it for a long time. It is for this reason that most of them are only active at night, making sure that someone is preserving them in their domain while they slumber. Many vampires learn magic in order to help them with this endeavour. If they're powerful enough, they could even corrupt the very land to make a permanent fog block out the sun. You'll find many elder and well-established public vampires do this sort of thing quite often. The reason this hurts them is actually quite simple. The sun is made of pure radiant energy. Despite what some clerics and paladins will tell you, radiant damage is not holy damage, but pure blinding light enough to actually hurt someone. Now, vampires don't take more damage from this than they would anyone else. They don't have a particular weakness for it. Rather, their unique nature and the curses of the gods put upon them means that they just have no natural guard against our sun. Much like many undead, actually. So there is a religious play at work, of course, since many gods use the power of radiant energy. It's not holy, but pure light. Another interesting weakness of theirs is running water. It would burn them the same way acid does us. This is usually any natural source of water, with a few exceptions. A river, a stream, a sea, or an ocean would be unsafe to a vampire. But something like a pool, a swamp, or a calm lake would be fine since the water is still. The reason this hurts them is actually a bit murky, pun not intended. The religious reason would be because water is holy, and running water is pure and free from pathogens and corruption, while stagnant water might be too dirty. It has lost its holy nature, and is therefore no longer able to protect you. While some would think it's things like, well, they say spirits cannot cross water, and in order for the vampire to do so, they must give up the many souls they have consumed, heavily weakening it, and undoing all healing they have done by consuming those souls, essentially turning them to dust. Now, the next weakness is a wooden stake to the heart. This only works if they are in their resting place and slumbering. Driving one into their heart while they're still awake is... well, I was about to say it's a bad idea, but if your intention is to kill them, it's actually not that bad of an idea. I would just recommend using a different weapon. They must be slumbering for the desired effect to take place, and it must be made of wood. If the vampire is a spawn, or newly freed one, it might destroy them instantaneously, but if they're an older one, it would merely stuck them there until it is removed. They will be paralyzed and unable to do anything. The why to this one is a little weird. See, it started as a theory of what's left of the vampire's being can be found in its unbeating heart. So they tried stabbing and shooting at it, and the vampire just laughed at them and killed them. So that clearly didn't work. Over time, they found out that it must be wood, and they must be slumbering. The wood is because of religious reasons, obviously. They should be of the coffin, and so wood shall bound them back to it. As to the why they must be slumbering, it's because they aren't resisting in that moment. That's not to say that they're physically resisting, mind you. It's more... it's hard to describe. Look, vampires aren't purely physical beings. I mean that they're there and they're in front of you and you can touch them and all that. It's more so, they're so emotional in nature that they can actually alter themselves in the moment. Now when they're awake and in a fight, and you stab them with a wooden stake in the heart, they're going to ignore that and treat it like anything else that's attacking them, because in that moment they believe they're powerful. But if they're slumbering and have their own natural thoughts, they're more likely to revert to their previous personality and more likely to be accepting of the weaknesses around them. This is actually the main reason so many of them are so melodramatic, by the way. The last weakness I will discuss is actually a little funny. They cannot enter a residence without permission from someone currently inside of it or from the owner. They can also enter if they own it, or even just a part of it, and I should note this takes in the exact definition of residence, meaning a home or a place someone is living in. A public building, or one that no one currently owns and lives in, is free game. I'm going to be completely honest with you, I have no solid idea on why this actually is the case. My leading theory is because of a slight connection with demons and other fiends. Like how you must invite in a fiend and make pacts and bargains with them. You have to be the one who opens the portal to allow them in. The vampire is similar in this regard. The reason theirs is more literal and almost comical to the fact that there's physically nothing stopping them, but they still can't enter, is actually because they're native to this plane, and so they have to have the same rules while being from here. It seems a bit silly, but I think that's where this comes from. Right, now let's get into their more notable powers. For a start, vampires are shapeshifters, prolific ones at that. There are two forms that they can all take, well, the true vampires can at least. Those are the simple bat and the cloud of mist, both very useful for the same reason, as traversal and a quick escape should they need to. But some vampires can take on many more forms, such as wolves, bears, and other animals, to some more interesting, monstrous vampiric forms. Some of these are unique to them too, forms only a vampire can take up and are reflective of their nature. You don't see these often since, while it's rare that they can take up these forms to begin with, but the power behind them is clear. I knew of a vampire who would experiment on his own spawn in order to permanently make them monstrous. He treated them more like attack dogs than people, but my were they efficient. They are also able of just walking on walls. While the weaker ones might crawl on all fours, almost like a spider skittering upon a surface, the older ones can simply walk on a ceiling or a wall as if it was the floor. Do I need to tell you why this is useful? I think everyone knows why this is an incredible power. Their next power is their immense healing capabilities. They will heal before your very eyes in a matter of seconds. Not only that, when they drain your blood, they drain your very life force, and so heal for just as much harm as they do. This is why hunting them is best left to those that are professionals and truly committed to the task, because if you can't, shall I say, out-damage their healing, they will quickly destroy you and become more powerful in doing so. I should note, if they are in sunlight or running water, as I talked about before, they cannot heal and are in fact harmed when doing so. So if your plan is to hunt them, make sure you trap them in one of them. I should also note that this prevents them from using their escape forms when they shape change. So you really need to trap them in one if you truly wish to kill them. Another thing at the vampire's disposal is the very wildlife. Many animals and some plants call the vampire master, and the vampire is able to summon and call upon them at a whim. All sorts of things can hear this call too, from bats, wolves, to even rats if they're indoors. Many swarms of mundane animals alongside what other minions they have collected. This is something they don't really plan, it's more they'll pull out of their sleeve if they think it's needed. Lastly, they have a powerful form of hypnosis, the charm of the vampire as some call it. They are able to make someone fall under their sway. Even during combat, they might gaze into the eyes of one of your companions and make them stop fighting. Most won't turn their swords on you in this moment, it's more so, how do I put this? They would view the vampire as one of their closest friends, and if they view you as a friend as well, from their point of view, their two greatest friends are fighting each other in that moment, and they want to protect you both. But because of this hypnosis, their perception of the attack is flawed. They think you're attacking their friend and so will stop you, and they won't notice that the vampire is attacking you back. You can break this effect by simply hitting the person out of it, or if the vampire suddenly attacks them, though the vampire only really does so if they know it's already safe to do so, and they're gonna start with the bite, so it's probably too late for them. This effect will last a whole day if uninterrupted too, and they can do so on more than one person at a time. They just have to do it one after the other. If you fear the vampire will pull this trick, do not look it in the eyes. In fact, because of how alluring they can be, just don't look at it in general. I know that makes it really hard, but you've got to understand how difficult it is to resist this effect. But what makes it more powerful and interesting is what happens upon repeat usage. For they will slowly break down the person until they are nothing more than a thrall for the vampire, a minion who will obey any command. Now, people can be broken out of this horrid enslavement, but my is it hard to do so unless you truly know and care about the victim. It is sadly not worth the time or the risk to free every thrall, just the ones you truly care about. Now then, this is where my telling of tales of vampires is probably going to differ from others. See, vampires are very evil beings, probably the worst of the worst, at least undead-wise. So with that in mind, I highly recommend you destroy them on sight. That being said, the most interesting tale I have with a vampire is the time I worked with one as a reluctant ally. Before you think anything, I wasn't under its charm or hypnosis. I just made sure of that magically. It was an impossible act for them to do so. My mind was warded, so to speak. See, sometimes you have to work with an evil to end a greater evil. After all, one of my greatest allies is one of my closest associates is a green dragon. That sounds better. And we have helped each other out more times than I can count. So, when you put me in a situation where I have to ally with an outcasted vampire, or a demonic invasion, well, I'm gonna side with the vampire. His name was Gaster, and I still don't know what he was outcasted by his clan for after being freed, and I don't trust him as far as I can throw him. He's also not like most vampires you would imagine. He's not tall, dark, handsome, and a brooding aristocrat. He's more like a savage caveman. A surprisingly well-spoken one in that, and I don't mean that he uses a verbose vocabulary like I do myself. It's more so he speaks calmly, plainly, and understandably. Yet despite his more wild and base appearance, he was actually a skilled wizard, believe it or not. Not as much as myself, obviously, but he had more than enough methods to compensate for that. He also rode atop a dragon like I do mine Zamuk, though his was a blue dragon who seemed a little out of place given this happened in a forest, but he was hypnotizing the thing, something I usually would take issue with were it not for the fact that I knew that dragon, and all I will say is he deserves this fate. But the main reason we teamed up was quite simple actually. His camp was attacked by a scouting group of demons, and he saw that I was on my way to end their invasion, and so offered me his aid. In truth, I was actually being a bit melodramatic at the time, because I sincerely thought I was going to die this day, as I couldn't stop the invasion on my own. So his help was... well, I needed him, let's put it bluntly. To this day, I'm not sure if there was a catch in our little deal, but since it has been several years, the Demon Gate is closed, and I've yet to hear from him, nor has he taken over the land, I'm starting to think there wasn't one. But I'm not a gambling man. We closed that gate just in the nick of time too. Were it open for another day or so, it might have pulled out something far more scary. But that is what I thought the most interesting tale I had of an encounter with a vampire. Sure, I could have talked about the time I have slain one or two, or that time I found out a king was being controlled by one, but I feel this was more intriguing, as I have a little bit of a takeaway from it. Vampires, at the end of the day, are still quite fascinating, but they're not that complex of beings. I'm sure that Gaster only worked of me out of survival instinct, and that is the driving force behind most of his actions. Many vampires are driven by power and domination. They want to control the world and have many abilities to act on these impulses. Even the spawn below them would do the same thing should the power balance be swapped around. The thing you've got to keep in mind is that once you can predict their driving force, you can guess what they're going to do, but never underestimate how far they will go to do it. Thank you for listening to my tales. I'm the Ashspawn. Feel free to leave a like, comment, or subscribe. It would really mean a lot to me. But, till next we meet, fellow traveller, have a good day.